The sky over Red Mesa Wash tore open, a sulfur-yellow rip in a bruised purple cloud. Lightning, thin and wicked as a talon, clawed the iron heart of the windmill. The blade screamed, a high metallic protest against the sudden violence of the gears. But Silas Hartwell didn't flinch. He sat on a low stool in his barn, the wide doors barred against the deluge, the air thick with the smell of wet dust, old leather, and the sharper tang of ozone. In his hands, a length of heavy saddle skirting lay draped across his knees. His needle, thick and curved, punched through the leather with a steady, rhythmic pop, pull, tug, tighten. The waxed threads sang with attention. Silas worked in silence. He had lived in silence for 8 years. The thunderhead wasn't a storm. It was a war. It hammered his tin roof with percussion that rattled the glass in the cabin 50 yards away. But inside the barn, Silas Hartwell stitched. This was his rhythm. The world outside could end, but this saddle needed mending. The silence wasn't peace. It was a boundary. It was the wall he had built between the man he was and the man he had become after the canyon fever swept through this valley like a grass fire, taking his wife, Sarah, and their infant son, Eli. He was pulling a knot tight when the motion caught his eye. It wasn't the lightning. It was movement at the north gate, 100 yards distant. He froze, the needle halfway through the leather. He squinted into the gray sheet of the downpour. They weren't riders. They were on foot, materializing from the rain like spirits conjured by the storm itself. 10 figures, cloaked in blankets and soaked buckskin, moving with a fluid purpose that defied the mud trying to claim their feet. They moved straight toward his cabin. Not the barn, the cabin. Silas set the saddle down. The movement slow, deliberate. His body, stiff from 8 years of solitude and hard labor, uncoiled. He rose and moved to the barn wall, peering through a crack in the warped planking. They were women, Apache. They walked not like refugees, but like soldiers executing a retreat. Their shoulders were back, though he could see the exhaustion in the slump of the eldest. Leading them was a woman who walked as if the mud owed her passage. She stopped at his porch, the other 9 fanning out behind her in a silent, protective crescent. Silas watched her survey the ranch. Her gaze flicked to the barn, and for a heart-stopping second, he felt seen. She knew he was there. She turned back to the cabin door. She did not knock with her knuckles. She drew a long knife from a sheath on her hip and rapped the heavy pine door with the flat of the blade. 3 taps, measured. Not begging, not meek. It was an announcement. Silsa's hand moved, by instinct, to the rifle rack he kept just inside the barn door. His fingers brushed the cold steel of his Winchester. 8 years. 8 years since anyone had knocked on that door. The traders left his supplies at the gate. He left the money in the box. He had spoken perhaps 1,000 words in those 8 years, mostly to his mule. And as his hand hovered on the rifle, he saw the other lights, down in the wash, far below the rim of his ranch. Bobbing lanterns cut through the gloom. Maybe 6, maybe 7 riders, combing the creek bed, their progress slowed by the flash flood. Pursuers. The woman at the door knocked again. 3 taps, louder this time, cutting through the receding drum of the rain. Silas moved, keeping low, slipping from the barn and dashing the 50 yards to the cabin's back door. He entered his cold home, the smell of wood smoke long dead in the hearth. He moved through the darkness to the front room, standing just to the side of the door. He heard them speaking. Low, guttural, rushed. Mescalero. He didn't speak the tongue, but he knew the sound of urgency. Then, one phrase, clear and sharp, reached him through the wood. It was the lead woman's voice. Shelter before thunder ends. The voice was low, strained, but held no fear. It was a statement of fact. Silas peered through the small, grime-covered window beside the door. He could see them clearly now. He saw the details a man alone learns to read. Their moccasins were shredded, wrapped in torn strips of blanket. The hems of their dresses were scorched, blackened by fire. And then he saw the child, On the back of the youngest woman, a girl who looked no older than 16, was a cradle board. Tucked inside, wrapped tight, was a baby. It wasn't crying, it was awake, its small, dark eyes wide, watching the rain fall from the eaves. Unhurt, watchful. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. It was a ghost punch, the memory of his own son, Eli, wrapped in a blue blanket. He had dug the grave with his own hands, the ground hard as iron. He looked back at the leader. She was staring right at the window, right at him. Her face was stark, carved from stone and determination, her black hair plastered to her high cheekbones by the rain. She held his gaze. She spoke again, this time just for him. They wear scout badges. Silas waited. They ride for pay. She continued, her voice tight. Not for law. She didn't need to say more. Mercenaries. Hired guns given the protection of a badge to clear the land. He'd heard stories of it happening south, near the border. Contractors who claimed Apache raids to mask their own theft, clearing territory for the railroad or the big cattle syndicates. A sudden shift in the air made him look up. The deluge was stopping. The violent roar of the storm softened, replaced by a steady, heavy dripping from the eaves. The thunderheads were moving east, the battle moving on. Danger. The slackening rain meant sound would carry. The pursuers in the wash would hear voices. They would see the cabin smoke, if he lit a fire. Silas looked down at his porch. The evidence was already there. 10 sets of tracks, braided across the mud, leading directly to his door. He couldn't send them away. To send them away was to sentence them. He couldn't pretend they hadn't come. Neutrality was gone. It had been gone the moment she knocked with that knife. He had spent 8 years building a fortress of peace, a quiet tomb where nothing could hurt him because nothing could touch him. He had chosen peace. He reached for the heavy iron bar that secured the door. His hand, calloused and scarred from stitching leather and mending fences, closed around the cold metal. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Eli. He thought of the watchful, silent child on the young woman's back. Silas Hartwell lifted the bar from its brackets. The thud of it hitting the floorboards was the loudest sound the house had heard in 8 years. He pulled the door open. The 10 women stood motionless. The leader, her hand still resting on the hilt of her knife, met his eyes. She did not smile. She did not bow. She simply waited. Her name, he would learn, was Nalina Whitebird. Inside, Silas said. His voice was a rusty hinge, cracking from disuse. They moved as one. They flowed past him into the cabin, bringing the cold air and the smell of wet wool with them. They did not crowd. They spaced themselves, covering the windows, the back door, the center of the room. The young mother with the child immediately sat in the darkest corner, turning her body into a shield. Silas barred the door again. The room was dark, lit only by the gray, fading stormlight. He moved to the hearth, his hands working automatically. He struck a match, the sulfur flare illuminating the women's faces. They were exhausted, streaked with mud, but their eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He lit the kindling he kept stacked. The dry tinder caught, flames licking up the seasoned juniper. The fire crackled, a small, defiant noise against the silence. As the hearth caught, steam began to rise from their wet hair and clothes. And with the steam, another smell lifted into the air. It was sharper than the rain, colder than the mud. It was the metallic, biting smell of fear. Nalina Whitebird stood by the fire, but she wasn't warming her hands. She was watching Silas. He turned to speak, to ask the question who, but the sound stopped him. It carried on the newly clear air, thin and cold from Juniper Crossing, a mile down the wash. A single, triumphant blast from a hunting horn. They had lost the trail in the storm. Now, in the sudden quiet, they had seen the smoke from his chimney. The hunt had found them. The horn blast echoed off the mesa, sharp and clear in the rain-washed air. It was a sound of triumph, a sound that didn't belong in Silas Hartwell's 8 years of silence. In the cabin, the 10 women froze. The young mother, Elia, instinctively turned, pressing her body over the cradle board. her knuckles white where she gripped the pine floor. Silas moved to the single oil lamp on the mantel, struck a match, and touched it to the wick. He kept the flame low, a small, greasy yellow halo that pushed the shadows back but didn't dare challenge them. The fire in the hearth was the room's true light, painting their faces in flickering shades of orange and red. "They found the smoke," Silas stated. His voice was still rough, but the rust was breaking free. The leader, Nalina, nodded. She showed no surprise. They were close. She stepped fully into the light. And for the first time, Silas could truly see her. She was perhaps 30, her face possessing a stark, weary beauty. But it was her eyes that held him. They were old, ancient, filled with a sharp, assessing intelligence that missed nothing. She looked at his rifle on the wall rack, at the barred door, at the way he stood, balanced on the balls of his feet. "I am Nalina Whitebird," she said. Her voice was low. "These are my sisters," she gestured, and names passed through the small room, spoken like a roll call, a quiet testament of survival. Tua, Sani, 2 women, sisters themselves, who looked wiry and fast, their hands never straying from the knives at their belts. Elia, the young mother in the corner, who nodded but did not look up, her focus entirely on the child. Marisol Hawk, a tall woman with a long braid and a faint, jagged scar on her chin. She stood near the back door, her head cocked, listening. Pahana, Isha Greyfeather, Rowena, Blue Star, Tala Rain. Each woman acknowledged her name with a dip of her chin, their eyes sweeping the room, noting exits, noting weapons. 10 women, no men with them, no warriors. Just this group, ranging from the young mother, Elia, who couldn't be more than 16, to the eldest, Isha Greyfeather, whose face was a map of sun and sorrow. "You're Mescalero," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "From Cinder Bluff," Nalina confirmed. "We had winter stores, dried meat, corn, blankets, enough to see us through the cold moons." She paused, and the crackle of the fire filled the silence. "A livestock contractor wanted the land. He said we were raiding. He claims we stole 200 head." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "We have 3 horses, lame, hidden in the wash. This contractor, his men came 2 nights ago. They burned the stores. All of it. They burned it to make the lie look true." Silas stared into the fire. He knew the story. It was the oldest story in this territory. Greed wearing the mask of progress. "He has a name," Nalina said, her voice dropping. "The contractor." She moved to the central pine table, the one Silas hadn't eaten at with another person in 8 years. From under her saturated blanket, she produced a heavy, leather-wrapped bundle, tied with rawhide. She laid it on the table. The wet leather shined in the lamplight. "He is called Forsyth Coal Freight." She untied the knot and folded back the leather. Inside was a thick book, a freight ledger. Its pages were filled with neat, spidery script, columns of numbers, dates, and signatures. But it was the emboss on the cover that made Silas's blood stop. It was a simple seal, an F and a C, intertwined around a railroad spike. The room, the storm. The women, they all dissolved. Silas was 200 miles south, 8 years gone. He was standing in a barren draw, the sun beating down, the dust so thick it choked the sky. A relocation. The men with the badges had called it. Shoving settlers and Apaches into the same narrow canyon, pushing them toward a reservation that was nothing but alkali dust. He remembered the sound. A few scattered shots from the ridge. Planned. Panic. A manufactured stampede. He remembered the wagon overturning. He remembered Sarah's hand, her fingers smaller than he'd ever realized, slipping from his grasp as the wave of terrified people and horses swept her away. He'd found her hours later, the dust still settling. Eli, his son, was crushed in her arms, and on the side of the wagon that had started it all, the wagon that had accidentally blocked the pass, had been that seal, Forsyth Coal Freight, the company that had the government contract for the relocation. Silas put a hand on the table to steady himself. The wood grain felt alien, too real. He looked at Nalina. The grief he had buried under 8 years of silence was now a living thing in the room. hot and sharp as a fresh wound. He hadn't just lost his family to canyon fever. He had lost them to a name. Before he could speak, a new sound cut through the night. It was high and piercing. Not the hunting horn. Wee fip fip. One long whistle, followed by two short. Silas's head snapped up. His hand shot out, gesturing for silence. He moved to the window. Peering through a small circle he rubbed clean. The lanterns were closer now, fanning out at the mouth of the wash. Wee fip fip. The signal came again, from a different direction. They were coordinating. Mercs. Silas breathed, his voice a rasp. Canyon bred, not soldiers. Soldiers use bugles, mercs use whistles. They know this land. The air in the cabin crackled. The women didn't wait for an order from Nalina. It was as if the whistle had been a signal for them, too. In a series of quiet, economical movements, they armed themselves. Tua and Sani produced long, thin blades from hidden sheaths in their bodices. Marisol Hawk, the tall woman, knelt by a rolled rug, unfastening it. It wasn't a rug, it was a carrying case. From it, she slid a short, powerful bow, already strung, and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers. Isha Greyfeather, the elder, pulled a heavy, old dragoon pistol from her skirts. But it was Alia, the young mother, who surprised him. She shifted the cradle board, reached into a sack of oats Silas kept by the hearth, and pulled out a compact carbine, its barrel sawed short. She checked the action, her movements practiced and sure, all while the baby slept peacefully on her back. Silas looked at them. 10 women, exhausted, cold, but not helpless. They were a fighting force. They had chosen his ranch not as a sanctuary, but as a fortress. His decision to open the door changed. It was no longer about pity. It was about alliance. He turned from the window. The past 8 years of stitching leather and mending fences fell away. The man who had built this ranch, the man who had laid the stone for the hearth and set the gears for the windmill, took over. He grabbed a nub of chalk from the mantel. With one sweep of his forearm, he cleared the table of dust and crumbs. They're splitting up, he said. He began to draw, the white chalk stark against the dark pine. He sketched the cabin, the barn, the windmill. The wind is from the northwest. They'll circle downwind. They'll smell the smoke, but they won't hear us easily from that direction. That's their blind approach. He drew a long, wavering line. My irrigation sluice. It runs from the cistern behind the house, straight to the north pasture. It's dry, 3 feet deep, covered with planks. It's a tunnel. It's our way out, or our way in. He tapped the drawing of the windmill, the gear brake. I can rig it, release it, and it screams like a banshee. It'll draw their attention. He looked up at Nalina. The women had gathered around the table, their face grim in the lamplight, studying his map. We have 3 choices, Silas said, his voice flat. We hide, we run, we stand. Hiding is finished. Tua, one of the sisters, said, her voice sharp. They have the smoke. They have our tracks. We can't run, Nalina said. She glanced at Alia and the sleeping child. Not in this mud. Not with the child. They'd ride us down before we made the wash. They expect us to run. She placed her hand on the table, next to Silas's map. We wait. One night. We are cold. We are tired. We repair our moccasins. We eat. We make the child warm. She looked Silas in the eye. They are arrogant. They've been hunting us for 2 days. They think we are just women. They'll be sloppy in the dark. We wait for the first gray light, the hour before dawn, when they are cold and tired of waiting. Then we move. Silas nodded slowly. It was a good plan. A soldier's plan. It bought them time. It gave them the advantage of the ground. Squelch! The sound was sharp, immediate. It came from the back porch. Not the front, the back. A single boot, settling deep in the mud, right outside the door. Every person in the room went utterly still. Silas's hand moved in a blur, pinching the lamp's wick. The cabin was plunged into absolute darkness, the only light the faint, dying red embers in the hearth. He reached out in the blackness and tapped the table twice with his knuckles. Tap, tap. A signal from a life long past. Dark hold. Be still. No one breathed. The silence was so profound Silas could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. Then they all heard it. A faint scraping sound. Click, rattle. A gloved hand was on the back door latch. It twisted. The latch held. The bar was in place. A pause. A muffled curse from outside. The latch rattled again. Harder this time. The wood of the door groaning in its frame. Silas felt a cold dread. Colder than the rain. His dogs. He missed his dogs. Buster and Red. They were good dogs. Loud dogs. They'd be tearing the door down right now. But they were long gone. Buried on the ridge with Sarah and Eli. The quiet he had curated for 8 years. His shield against the world was now a liability. The man outside, hearing nothing, would assume the cabin was empty. The rattling stopped. Another squelch as the boots shifted. Then, footsteps, moving away from the door. Toward the barn, a scout, checking the perimeter. Silas let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He could feel Nalina's presence beside him, her warmth in the dark. He could smell the rain on her clothes and the faint, clean scent of sage. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, his whispers so low it was just a vibration in the air. They're testing. They'll be back when they find the barn empty. 2, they'll bunch up. They'll come in force. He looked around at the shadows, at the 9 other women he could feel but not see. We can't hide. We can't run. Not yet. His hand found the table, his fingers tracing the chalk line of the irrigation sluice. If we fight, he whispered. The words meant for all of them. We don't fight like them. We don't stand in the open. We fight like builders. We use the ground. We use every nail, every plank, every shadow. We make the ranch itself fight for us. From the darkness. Nalina's voice came back, just as low, just as certain. Show us, the single word. Show us. Hung in the absolute darkness. A command, not a plea. Silas moved. He didn't relight the lamp. A single light source was a target. Instead, he went to the hearth, grabbed the poker, and stirred the embers. A low, pulsing red light bloomed, casting demonic shadows that danced on the walls. It was just enough. The 8 years of silent grief receded, peeling back like sun-scorched wallpaper. The man who stood in the dim light was not Silas the hermit. He was Silas Hartwell, the builder. The man who had, with his own 2 hands, raised these walls, set the mill, and dug the sluice. He had built this place to keep life in. Now, he would use it to keep death out. Nalina, he said, his voice finding its old authority. Your people, your plan. She didn't hesitate. She knelt by the hearth, the red light catching the sharp planes of her face. She scooped a handful of gray ash from the cold edge of the firebox, spreading her fingers. She let it dust onto the dark hearthstone, creating a pale, crude canvas. With one finger, she drew. Her lines were swift and certain. She drew Silas's map from memory, but added to it. She drew the cabin, then sketched a half-moon of small X's where the whistle code had come from. They are 10, perhaps 12, she whispered, her voice carrying to every woman in the room. They believe we are trapped. They will make a single and strong push from the front to flush us out the back, where others will be waiting. Her finger drew a line from the back of the cabin. The sluice. You said it's dry. Bone dry, Silas confirmed. 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, covered in planking. It ends in the gully, 200 yards west. Good. She drew an arrow following the sluice line, then branching out, creating a pincer. 7 will go. Tua, Sani, Marisol, Pahana, Isha, Rowena, Tala. You will move through the sluice. You will circle. You will come up behind them. She looked at the 3 who remained Elia, the young mother, Blue Star, a woman with wide, steady eyes, and herself. We 3 stay here, with him. Her finger tapped the square she'd drawn for the cabin. We are the bait. We make the noise. We make the light. We pull them in. The 7 women nodded. Not a word. They began checking their meager weapons, tightening their moccasins. They'll expect the front, Silas said, picking up the thread. So we give them the side, the corral. He pointed out the window. They'll use it for cover. They'll come along the fence line. He looked at Tua and Sani. There's a patch of cholla cactus by the cistern, the jumping kind. You know it. Their faces remained impassive, but Sani gave a short, sharp nod. I need trip lines, Silas said. Low, ankle high. String them in the shadows of the corral lane. We don't want to stop them. We want to hobble them. Spines in the boot, in the ankle. A man screaming in the dark is worth 10 quiet ones. It breeds panic. The two sisters vanished into the darkness. A moment later, Silas heard the back door unbarred and reopened. A whisper of cold air. And then they were gone. Next, Silas turned to Elia, who still held the baby, now stirring fitfully. The smoke pots, you know the mix. Saltpeter, damp sawdust, a little sulfur, she whispered back, her eyes on her child. It makes a thick, white smoke. It blinds, it chokes, but it is not a poison. I have saltpeter in the barn, for curing. Sawdust is under the woodpile, Silas said. He looked at the baby. The child. The smoke stays low, Elia said, a fierce, protective note in her voice. I will keep him high. The cradle board will go on the mantel shelf. He will be above it. He will be safe. She would not be left out of the fight. Silas nodded, respecting the steel in her. Make 3 buckets. We'll put one by the front door, one by the back. While Elia slipped out to gather her materials, Silas moved to his spring house, a small stone dugout beneath the cabin floor, accessed by a trap door in the pantry. The air that rose was cold and smelled of damp earth and apples. He worked quickly, his hands finding things in the dark by touch alone. He pulled out 2 canvas packs, filling them with what little he had: a slab of smoked jerky, a bag of hardtack, 2 full canteens of fresh water. If this house falls, he said to Nalina, who watched him, you run light. You take these and you go through the sluice. Don't look back. She said nothing, but her eyes held his, acknowledging the grim reality. Now, for the builder's tricks. Silas grabbed a spool of thin, strong snare wire. He unbarred the back door and slipped out, melting into the shadow of the eaves. The rain had stopped, and the world was utterly, terrifyingly still. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip from the roof. He moved like a ghost, his feet, hardened by years of walking his own land barefoot, finding silent purchase in the mud. He ran the wire from the back porch latch, looping it through a series of old, rusted eyelets he'd hammered in years ago to support climbing beans. He ran it around the corner, along the cabin wall, to the empty chicken shed. Inside, he hung 3 empty tin cans, nested, from the wire. He ran it further, to a loose plank on the wood pile, tying it off on a small cowbell hidden beneath. He returned to the porch, one tug on the wire near the door. From the chicken shed, a faint, metallic jingle. From the wood pile, a muffled clank. 3 different sounds, from 3 different places, all at once, phantom sentries. It would split their attention, make his one-man post sound like a dozen defenders. He was moving back inside when his forearm scraped hard against a protruding nail by the door frame. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath. It wasn't just a scratch. The nail had caught the edge of an old, puckered scar, a long-healed tear from a broken wagon tongue. From the stampede, it ripped the old wound open. A clean, 3-inch gash. Blood, dark in the moonlight, welled instantly, dripping onto the porch. He clamped his other hand over it and slipped back inside, barring the door. Nalina saw it immediately. The red embers were just bright enough to catch the sheen of wetness on his hand. You're hit, she stated. It's nothing. A nail. It is not nothing. It will slow you. She pointed to the table. Sit. Before he could argue, she was at his wife's old sewing box. From it, she took not the waxed thread he used for leather, but a fine needle and a spool of silk thread. She lit the lamp, turning the wick up just enough to see, creating a small, dangerous pool of light. Show me, she commanded. He sat, extending his arm. The blood ran freely now, a stark crimson against his trail-dusted skin. She cleaned it with a rag dipped in his whiskey. The sting made his jaw clench, but her touch was impossibly steady. Her fingers were sure, deft, and impersonal. She threaded the needle. "This will hurt," she said. "It's not the first time." She began to stitch. He watched her, not the wound. Her head was bent, her black hair falling forward, hiding her expression. But he could see the focus in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes never left the needle. She was not just a leader. She was a mender. "You've done this before," he said, his voice quiet. "Many times." She replied, pulling a stitch tight. "Flesh is easier than leather. It gives." They sat in the small circle of light, the only sound the pop of the needle through his skin and the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping child. The other women worked in the shadows around them, loading the carbine, sharpening blades, tuning Marisol's small rawhide drum not for war, but for signals, 5-note taps that would carry in the gullies. The silence between Silas and Nalina stretched, filled by the intimate, painful act of her mending. "It wasn't canyon fever," he said, the words tearing out of him, as ragged as the wound. She didn't stop her work. "I know." "It was a stampede, caused by that name, Forsyth and Cole." He was breathing hard now, the confession locked in his chest for 8 years finally breaking free. "I was there. I had her hand. My wife, Sarah, I had her, and our son, he was in her arms. I let go. The crowd, I let go." He closed his eyes. The guilt was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. "I didn't hide from grief. Nalina, I hid from this. From the fact I was a coward. I ran. I came here where the world couldn't test me again, where I couldn't fail anyone else." Nalina finished the last stitch. She bit the thread, her teeth white and strong. She wrapped his forearm in a clean strip of linen, her fingers gentle for the first time, the knot she tied firm and secure. She looked up, her dark eyes finding his in the lamplight. Her gaze was not pitying. It was hard, clear, and absolute. "We do not fix yesterday," she said, her voice low and fierce. "The dead are gone. The guilt is a ghost. It cannot hold a rifle. It cannot bar a door." She placed her hand on his, just for a second, her palm calloused and warm. "We decide tomorrow." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was not forgiveness. It was a creed, a soldier's creed, a survivor's creed. She wasn't offering him comfort. She was giving him an order. She was giving him back his purpose, a new sound. The wind. The storm's roar had finally died. The world outside was settling into a pre-dawn hush, the only sound the steady dripping of water from the eaves. Nalina stood, her face going back into shadow. "The rain has stopped." Silas rose, flexing his newly stitched arm. The pain was sharp, but it was clean. He blew out the lamp. Darkness reclaimed the room. "Yes," he said. "It means voices will carry. It means they'll move." Tua and Sani slipped back inside, silent as owls. They nodded once. The traps were set. Elia had her smoke pots ready by the doors. The 7 women gathered at the pantry, lifting the trapdoor to the springhouse, their gateway to the sluice. Silas moved to his post, the frost-clouded window by the front door. He picked up his Winchester, the cold steel familiar and comforting. His eyes fell on the table, in the faint, dying glow of the embers. The leather-bound ledger waited. It was the cause of his wife's death. It was the reason these women were here. It was a book of names and numbers. A loaded truth, waiting for the hammer to fall. "Outside," a man coughed, the sound muffled but distinct. They were close. The siege was about to begin. The cabin was a box of held breath. Outside, the pre-dawn air was cold and heavy, the mud sucking at the boots of the men trying to move silently. Silas stood at his window, the Winchester's stock cool against his cheek. The world was a mess of gray shadows and blacker voids. He could hear them now, not as footsteps, but as a subtle displacement of the night. A muffled cough, the tink of a rifle barrel grazing a fence post, the low, guttural murmur of a command. Nalina materialized at his elbow. So quiet, he only knew she was there by the faint scent of sage and the warmth radiating from her arm. She pressed something cold and sharp-edged into his palm, a shard of mirror, no bigger than a silver dollar. "The 7 are in the gully," she whispered, her breath a small cloud. "Marisol has the high ground. Tua and Sani are in place. The trap is set." He looked at her. In the gloom, her eyes were just reflections. 7, I thought. 5 to flank, she corrected, her voice impossibly low. Tua and Sani peeled off from the sluice. They are the fangs, close, by the porch and the horses. They know this part. Silas nodded, understanding. A pincer, with a close quarters trap. When you see their main lanterns, flash once, she instructed. A small wink. Marisol will see it. That means move. When I give the signal, flash twice. A full flash. That means strike. Silas clutched the mirror shard. His knuckles were white. 8 years of peace. And now his hands, calloused from mending, were about to start a war. Beside him, Elia had wedged the cradle board securely on the high mantel, well above where any smoke or stray shot might go. The baby slept on, oblivious. Blue Star stood by the barred back door, a heavy iron skillet in her hand, a grim, domestic weapon. A lantern was lit near the woodpile. A second one glowed near the windmill. They were impatient. The posse, 10 men by Silas's count, had split. He watched them, reading their strategy. 5 men, the main force, were creeping along his woodpile, using it as cover for a rush on the front door. 3 more had cut wide, heading for the high ground by the windmill. A flanking maneuver. The last 2, lazy and overconfident, held the horses in the wash, too far away to help. Nalina put her hand on his forearm, just above the fresh stitches. Her fingers were firm. Now, wink. Silas angled the mirror. He caught the light of the woodpile lantern and flicked his wrist, sending a tiny, star-like spark toward the western ridge. He did it 3 times. There was no reply. There wasn't supposed to be. The 5 men at the woodpile began their move. They came low and fast, silhouettes against the growing gray light. "Wait," Nalina breathed. The lead man, a big shadow in a long duster, kicked what he thought was a loose bundle of weeds. The night exploded. It wasn't a gunshot. It was Elia's smoke pots. The 2 by the porch and 1 by the corral fence ignited. A chemical reaction sparked by a tripwire. Thick, acrid white smoke poured out, clinging to the ground, obscuring everything below a man's waist. The lanterns, suddenly useless, became hazy, glowing halos in a sea of fog. "Chola!" a man screamed. The trip lines. The men, blinded by the smoke, stumbled into the Chola spine Silas and the sisters had strung. The sound was terrible, not just pain, but the sound of men betrayed by the ground they stood on. They shrieked as the barbed pods bit deep into their boots and ankles, crippling them. Nalina grabbed Silas's wrist. "Flash strike!" Silas flashed the mirror, a long, bright slash of light aimed at the ridge, and at the same instant, he yanked the first wire he had rigged. Jingle, clank, jingle. The sound was shockingly loud. The phantom sentry's tin cans in the chicken shed. The cowbell on the woodpile rang out from 2 empty corners of the yard. It worked perfectly. The mercenaries, already blind and in pain, opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit the smoke, but they were shooting at ghosts. They poured lead into the empty chicken shed, into the woodpile, wasting their first shots on the wrong targets. "Now, Tua," Nalina whispered, from beneath the porch, where she had been lying in the mud for an hour. Tua slid out. One of the mercenaries had stumbled back, his leg pierced by cactus, and had fallen against the porch steps. He was trying to reload. Cursing, Tua was on him like a spider. She didn't use a rifle. She used a short, curved hook blade. Silas saw the moonlight catch it for just a second. She hooked the man low, behind his knee, and pulled. A sharp, upward slice. The man didn't just scream. It was a high, thin sound, like a rabbit, that cut off as he collapsed. He wasn't dead, but his leg was useless. The fight was over for him. At the same moment, Sani made her move at the edge of the wash. The two horse holders were distracted, staring at the chaos at the cabin. Sani, who had crept through the creek bed, rose up beside the lead stallion. She didn't try to steal it. She slapped its flank with the flat of her hand, hard, and screamed a high-pitched Apache war cry. The horse, terrified, reared and bolted straight into its owner. The man went down in a tangle of reins and hooves, a heavy thud and a spray of mud. The second man dove for cover as the entire string of horses stampeded up the wash, disappearing into the darkness. Their escape route was gone. The four remaining men at the woodpile were in disarray. They were shooting wildly into the smoke. "The door! Silas!" Nalina yelled. "The decoy!" Silas took a deep breath. He aimed his Winchester not at a man, but at the lantern hanging from a hook on the porch. He held his aim, unbarred the heavy door, and, using all his strength, rammed it open with his shoulder. It crashed against the cabin wall. "They're in the house!" one of the men yelled, swinging his rifle toward the black, empty doorway. As they all turned, Silas fired. The rifle crack was deafening. Glass shattered. The lantern exploded, plunging the entire front yard into near-total darkness, lit only by the dying, smoky embers of the ground fog. "Back!" Silas yelled, pulling Nalina and Blue Star away from the doorway as return fire stitched the frame where they had been. But one man had been closer than they thought, hidden by the smoke. He lunged through the doorway, grabbing the first person he could find. It was Elia. He seized her by the hair, yanking her back, pressing a pistol to her head. The baby on the mantel let out its first cry, a thin, terrified wail. "Light, get a light, or she—" He never finished. Nalina moved. She was not a woman. She was a blur. She came from the man's blind side. Her hand shot out, not striking, but grasping his wrist, the one with the pistol. She twisted. Silas heard a sharp, wet pop of bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. The man howled, his hand useless. He tried to turn, to grab Nalina with his other hand, but she was already inside his guard. She spun, her body flush against his, her arm coming up under his chin. It wasn't a strike. It was a lock. She drove him backward into the wall. Her forearm pressed tight against his throat. He gurgled, clawing at her arm. Elia had already scrambled away, grabbing the skillet from Blue Star, her face a mask of primal fury. Protecting the baby, Nalina stared into the mercenary's bulging eyes, her breath hot on his face. Her whisper was colder than the grave. "Sleep." She held the pressure, her body a steel spring, until his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. He slid to the floor, unconscious but alive. It was then the other three, recovering their nerve, charged the dark doorway. "Now, Silas!" Nalina screamed. Silas didn't go for his rifle. He grabbed the second wire he had rigged, a thick leather thong that ran through a hole in the wall and out toward the windmill. He put his boot against the wall and pulled. "Scree!" The sound was inhuman. It was the shriek of a banshee, the sound of metal tearing itself apart. He had released the windmill's gear brake. The blades, catching the night breeze, began to spin freely, the unoiled, rusted gears screaming their protest. The three men charging the door stopped dead. They looked up, terrified. To them, in the dark and smoke. The sound wasn't a machine. It was a signal fire, an alarm, a massive attack. "It's the whole tribe," one yelled. "It's a signal." They bunched together in the open, looking wildly toward the windmill, their backs to the gully, which is exactly what Marisol, Pahana, and the rest of the flanking party were waiting for. "Now," Silas whispered, and he dropped the gear brake wire. The scree cut off as if sliced with a knife. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the noise. The men flinched, their nerves shattered. From the darkness on their flank, Marisol's voice rang out, clear and cold. "Drop your rifles. You're covered." Arrows hissed. Not to kill. They thudded into the ground at the men's feet. A rifle clattered in the mud, then another. From the wash, from the sluice. The rest of Nalina's women emerged, carrying lariats. The fight had lasted less than 5 minutes. Silas lit the lamp. The light revealed the chaos. One man on the floor, breathing heavily. Outside, the yard was a mess of groaning. Mud-covered men, their ankles bristling with choya, their hands being tied. 3 had fled. The 2 horse holders and 1 from the windmill crew had vanished into the night. Running on foot, 7 remained. They lay cursing, tied with Silas's own lariats, disarmed and humiliated. Silas walked out onto the porch, the rifle held low. Nalina joined him, wiping the sweat and grime from her face. She looked at the 7 men, their faces a mix of fear and rage. She looked at the man Tua had taken down, who was now being bandaged tightly, but bandaged by Isha Greyfeather. No one was dead. Silas looked at her in the dim light. "You could have," he said. "We could have." Nalina finished checking the ropes on the leader. She stood up and looked toward the east, where the sky was a faint, bruised purple. "We save killing," she said, her voice hard as the land itself. "For the ones who buy the torches." There was no sunrise. The world simply changed from black to a cold, civil gray, the color of ash and old iron. The air was sharp, promising a clear day that would offer them no cover. At Silverthorn Ranch, the 7 mercenaries were bound tight with lariats and pigging strings, left in the relative shelter of the barn. Isha Greyfeather, the elder, had left a bucket of water and a hunk of jerky within reach of one man, the one whose leg Tua had bound. "They will be found," Nalina had stated. It was not a question of mercy, but of practicality. The 3 who fled would either come back for them or send the law. They did not have hours. They had minutes. Silas had his mule, old Hezekiah, loaded with the 2 lightened packs of food, the smoke pot supplies, and extra water. The 10 women moved like shadows. Rowena and Tala had already taken the burlap sacks from the grain bin. They tied them to lariats, and as the group moved out, they were the last, walking backward, dragging the heavy sacking to smear their trail, to turn the distinct prints of 10 women and 1 mule into a broad, messy swath that looked like a dozen head of cattle had been driven through. They quit Silverthorn not through the gate, but through the dry irrigation sluice, the same one the 7 women had used for their flanking maneuver. It let them out into the gully, hidden from the main wash. Silas took the lead. This was his land, his map, the 8 years he had spent walking it in grief. He had unconsciously memorized every game trail, every rockfall, every seep of water. "We don't take the wash," he said, his voice low in the gray light. "We take the shortcuts. Juniper crossing first, then we cut up to the willow slough." He looked at Nalina. She carried the heavy leather-wrapped ledger in a deerskin satchel slung across her chest. It was the heart of their trouble and the only key to their salvation. "That's Juniper down there," he pointed. As they crested the first small ridge, the crossing was a wide, shallow part of the wash, now a churning soup of red mud from the storm. "The men who fled, they'll be back at the ranch by now," Marisol Hawks said, her voice tight. She loped beside Silas, her bow in her hand. "Let them," Silas said. "They'll find their friends tied and the ranch empty. They'll follow the tracks. The burlap will slow them, make them argue about which way we went, but they'll follow." He was right. 2 of the 3 stragglers had circled back, drawn by the silence. They found the ranch at full dawn, the quiet, the empty shell of the cabin, and their 7 comrades trussed like holiday birds in the barn, sent a jolt of pure rage through them. They cut their friends free, ignoring the groans and curses. Their leader, a man with a face like dried leather, looked at the smeared tracks leading into the gully. "They're on foot, and they got that hermit," he snarled. "They won't get far. Ride!" Rage, not strategy. Push them after. Silas and the women were already miles ahead, climbing out of the willow slough. The going was hard, the ground was slick, and the climb was steep. Alia, carrying her son, was breathing hard, her feet slipping. Silas watched Nalina. The satchel with the ledger was heavy, its strap cutting into her shoulder. When they reached a tight chimney of rock, a place where she would need both hands to climb, he stopped. He didn't ask. He just put his hands on the satchel. My turn. She met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, but the fire was still there. She was assessing him, this man who had hidden from the world, who was now leading a war party. She nodded once, slipping the strap from her head. Silas grunted as he took the weight, settling the leather across his own chest. It felt heavy as a tombstone, but it also felt right. His past, his wife's death, was bound in that book. Carrying it was a penance. They climbed. At the top, Rowena, the track sweeper, paused. She found a heavy bough of springy cedar and, working her way backward, she erased the scuff marks of their boots on the rock, a final act of housekeeping defiance. By mid-morning, they were at Dryladder Ridge. It was a barren spine of fractured shale, a place where the world seemed to be crumbling to pieces. Below them, in the canyon, Silas caught the glint of sun on a rifle barrel. They're coming, he said, and they're moving fast. Nalina looked back. We can't outrun horses for long. We don't have to, Silas said. He looked at the ridge, his builder's eye seeing not just rock, but weight and balance and weakness. This is Dryladder. The rock here, it's like marbles. They call it a slide for a reason. He pointed to a massive overhang of shale, balanced precariously. Marisol, your bow. See that keystone? The lighter one, holding the shelf. Marisol Hawk nodded, already fitting an arrow to her string. It won't take much, just a sharp crack. You'll start a rockfall, Nalina said, her eyes wide. Not a rockfall, Silas corrected. A slide. It won't hurt them, not if they're smart. But it will fill that trail with 10 feet of scree. It'll take them half a day to find a way around, or an hour to clear it. We need an hour. Marisol drew the bow. The string creaked. She let the arrow fly. It sped across the small canyon, striking the keystone with a sharp crack. For a second, nothing. Then, a groan. The shelf of rock shifted. It tilted, and then it dissolved. Not in a great crash, but in a long, rattling, hissing shush, as thousands of tons of shale poured down the cliff face, filling the narrow trail below in a river of gray. Clattering stone. Far below, they heard the pursuers shouting in anger, the sound of horses rearing. The chase was stalled. Silas turned. Let's go. That bought us time. They pushed on for another hour, until they reached a small, hidden pocket in the cliffs, a place Silas knew where a tiny spring fed a grove of old cottonwoods. It was an oasis of green in a world of red rock. We rest here, Silas said. Half an hour. We eat, we drink. We are no good to anyone running on empty. The tension broke. The women sagged against the trees. Aisha Greyfeather, the elder, built a small, smokeless fire from dry twigs. She mixed flour and water from one of the packs, and soon the smell of hot fry bread filled the air. Silas made coffee, black and strong, in his old tin pot. Elia sat on a flat rock, unwrapping her son, the baby. A boy with his mother's watchful eyes, was dry and calm. He made no sound, just observed. Elia gave him a strip of leather to gum, and he stared at the fire, at the strange, tall man, at the light filtering through the cottonwood leaves. Silas handed a piece of fry bread and a tin cup of coffee to Nalina. She had taken the ledger back from him, and it sat in her lap as she leaned against a tree. She took the bread. You know this land well. For a man who hides from it, it was a test, a small, sharp probe. Silas sat opposite her, the fire between them. I didn't know I was memorizing it. I was just walking, trying to wear out the ghosts. Forsyth and Cole, Nalina said, her voice quiet, not looking up from her coffee. You know the name. I know the seal, Silas admitted. I saw it on a freight wagon, 8 years ago, a relocation that went wrong. It's how my wife and son were lost. Nalina looked up, her gaze pinning him. It wasn't just a wagon, was it? It was a man, a name. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. The memory he had buried. The name on the crooked claim reports he'd seen just before the stampede. The name he had tried to forget. How did you know? "The ledger," she said, tapping the leather cover. "It is not just numbers. It is names, payouts for lost herd reports, payouts for scout duties. All signed, all approved by one man, a foreman who ran the whole territory. His signature is on every page. Hiram Cole." Silas breathed. The name felt like ash in his mouth. Hiram Cole. He was the one who signed the crooked claims, the one who pushed the settlers and the Apache into the same draw. He made the stampede. Nalina nodded slowly. "He runs the company's western division. He's the one who ordered Cinder Bluff burned. Your ghost, Silas. He is the man who hunts us now." The silence in the cottonwood grove was absolute. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It wasn't just his past. It was a single, shared enemy. The revenge story and the survival story had merged. "What's in the book?" Silas asked, his voice thick. "Enough," she said. "Enough to show he's been stealing from the army, from the settlers, from his own company, enough to show he's been using hired guns with scout badges to clear land he wants. It's enough to hang him, if it gets to the right person." "The right person," Silas repeated. He thought, not the local sheriff, who was probably on Cole's payroll. Not the army, who were too slow. It had to be federal. It had to be someone clean. "Mallow Junction," he said, "the idea forming. It's 2 days' ride, but it's a railhead, and the telegraph office. There's a deputy U.S. Marshal there, Ruth Carver." Aisha Greyfeather looked up from the fire. "A woman. Her father was the marshal. She grew up with a badge. She's tougher than any 3 men I know. And she's honest. We were friends. A long time ago. She hates these freight companies." Nalina looked at the sky. The sun was high. "Mallow Junction, before sunset tomorrow." It was a decision, a new, clear direction, as if to confirm it. A coyote yipped from the ridge above them. A single, sharp call. Tala Rain, who had been listening to the wind, smiled grimly. "The trickster calls. He says, 'Run clean, teeth behind.' The omen is good, but it means the chase is not over." They packed up, dousing the fire, leaving no trace, as they prepared to move out. Silas held up his hand, palm flat. "This," he said to the group, "is what I used on the freight teams. It means freeze, not just stop. Freeze. Don't breathe. Don't blink until I drop it." Nalina watched him, then held up her own hand, 2 fingers pointing down, curved like talons. "This is circle. It means the enemy is not where we see him. He is around us. You see this. You find cover and look to your flanks." They were a single unit now, sharing skills, sharing a purpose. Silas led them out of the grove, up a steep game trail that would take them to the basalt shelf, a high, flat plain where they could make good time. He crested the ridge first, Nalina right behind him. He froze. "Silas," she whispered. He didn't move. He just pointed. There, on the basalt, clear in the dried mud of the shelf, were hoof prints. Not the old, washed-out tracks of wild mustangs. These were fresh, shod horses, at least 5 of them, and they were pointed south, toward Mallow Junction. "The men from the windmill," Silas said, his voice flat and dead. "The ones who got away clean. They didn't run home." Nalina stepped beside him, her face grim. "They know the ledger. They know where we are going." Silas looked back the way they came, toward the shale-filled canyon where their pursuers were trapped. Then he looked forward, at the fresh tracks cutting across their path. The teeth were no longer just behind. They were now in front as well. Mallow Junction was not a town. It was a wound on the prairie, scabbed over with coal soot and pig iron. The air didn't smell of sage, it smelled of hot oil, livestock fear, and the sulphurous breath of the railroad. The noon freight sat hissing on the main spur, a long black serpent of steel and steam, a held breath waiting to be released. Silas and the 10 women slipped into the town's edge, not as a group, but as individuals, filtering between the cattle pens and the high stacks of railroad ties, melting into the shadows of the loading docks, the noise of the rail yard, the clanging of a hammer on an anvil in the smithy, the lowing of cattle, provided perfect cover. They regrouped behind the towering, soot-stained grain elevator. Alia, her baby mercifully asleep, looked pale, her eyes wide at the crush of industry. The others were tense, their hands on their hidden knives, overwhelmed by the angles and the noise of the white man's world. "Stay here. Out of sight," Silas commanded, his voice low. "Tua, up high. Count the hats. Marisol, Nalina. Stay with the group. I'll check the telegraph. I need to know if Ruth got my message." He had sent one 2 days ago, from a way station. Just a rumor, a whisper. Now he needed to confirm. He pulled his hat low, settling the weight of the ledger's strap across his chest. He left the relative safety of the shadows and stepped onto the main street. It was a river of mud, churned by wagon wheels and livestock. He walked with a purpose, his boots sinking into the muck, looking like any other rancher heading for the wire. The telegraph shack was a small box of pine. Pressed against the station house, the clack, 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 clack of the receiver was audible from 10 yards away. He pushed the door open. The heat inside was stifling. It smelled of ozone, cheap tobacco, and sweat. A young man, barely 20, sat hunched over the key, a green visor pulled low. Shading his eyes, he didn't look up. "Sending or receiving," the operator mumbled, his fingers still tapping. "Checking on a wire. For Marshall Carver." Silas said. The tapping stopped. The operator's hands froze above the key. He looked up, and Silas saw his eyes. They were terrified. "Line's been down," the operator stammered, his gaze darting to the window. "Storm damage. Nothing in or out." Silas looked at the receiver, which was even then chattering away, spitting out a ribbon of tape. "Seems to be working just fine." "That's just the rail line," the operator said, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "Internal traffic. Main line's dead. Sorry, mister." The lie was as thick and sour as the air in the shack. Silas leaned in, placing his scarred hands on the counter. He didn't raise his voice. "I sent a wire 2 days ago. To Ruth Carver. My name is Silas Hartwell. Did she get it?" The operator's face went white. He knew the name. "I don't know who you're talking about. Mr. I just worked the key." Silas stared at him. The man's fear a tangible thing, a confirmation of their worst fears. "Who paid you?" "I please, mister. They're watching. They're watching everything. Just go." "Who?" Silas pressed, his voice like iron. The operator just shook his head, looking past Silas. "Out the window. Go, please." Silas turned. He stepped back out into the muddy street, the hiss of the locomotive seeming to mock him. The trap was not behind them. They were in it. He scanned the street. His eyes, trained by 8 years of solitude, picked them out immediately. They weren't hiding. They were a statement. Across the street, lounging in front of the Forsyth Coal Freight Office, a new building. The only one with fresh paint were 3 men. They wore city coats of dark wool, buttoned back despite the chill, and polished boots. They had bowler hats, not Stetsons, but they stood like gun hands. They stood with their weight balanced, their hands never straying far from their hips. They were a different breed from the dusty posse at the ranch. These were professionals. He saw 2 more near the saloon, pretending to talk, but their eyes were raking the street, watching the station, watching the marshal's office. He made his way back to the grain elevator. The walk was the longest of his life, his back crawling, expecting a shout, a bullet. He slid into the darkness behind the elevator. Nalina and Tua were waiting. "They're here," Silas said, the words tasting like defeat. "The operator's been bought. He's terrified. He knew my name." "How many?" Nalina asked. Her hand was on the knife at her belt. "5 that I can see." Silas said, "But they're not trail trash. They're hired." Tua, who had scaled the ladder on the side of the elevator, dropped down, landing as silent as a cat. 8, she corrected. Her voice was flat, a simple report. 5 on the street. 2 on the roof of the hotel, across from the marshal's office. Snipers. 1 more, sitting on the boardwalk. pretending to be drunk, right by her door. 8 men, in an open town, with a railroad. They were cut off. Nalina and Marisol exchanged a look. This was a different kind of fight. No gullies, no trees, just angles and glass. "We wait," Nalina said. "We watch. We find her." "We don't have time to wait." Silas argued. "They know my name. That means they know we're here, or soon will be." As if summoned by his words, a shadow fell over the alley entrance. It was a boy, no older than 10, skinny, with a cap pulled low. He was whistling, kicking a small, rusted can. He looked like any other rail yard stray. He kicked the can, and it rolled to a stop at Silas's feet. The boy looked up, his whistling stopping. "You missed her. Hartwell." Silas's blood went cold. Nalina moved, blocking the alley, her hand on the boy's shoulder before he could blink. "Who sent you?" Nalina's voice was a low growl. The boy wasn't scared. He was just doing a job. "Man at the hotel. Paid me a nickel. Said to find the tall man from the Silverthorn Ranch who was asking about the marshal. Gave me this for you." He held out a small, folded card. Stiff, expensive stock. Silas took it. His fingers felt thick and clumsy. He unfolded it. The script was beautiful. Elegant copperplate. "Return the ledger to the Forsyth Coal office. You will be compensated generously for your time and trouble." Silas flipped it over. "More writing on the back, or we will bury the names with you." His stomach twisted. He folded the card, his hand shaking slightly. He tucked it deep into his pocket. He turned to Nalina. She had been reading it over his shoulder. He didn't look at her face. He just pointed to the bottom of the card, to the flourishing, arrogant signature. H. Cole, Hiram Cole. He was here, in Mallow Junction. Nalina's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cords. The old scar on her chin, usually a faint white line, seemed to pull, a stark reminder of her own history. She looked at the men across the street, at the freight office. Her eyes were burning. "They're not just waiting for us," she said. "They're inviting us." "It's a trap," Silas said. "They want the ledger. They'll kill us the second we show it." "We need Ruth," Silas insisted. "She's in that office. The man at the door. The snipers on the roof. They're all for her. She's pinned." "Then we unpin her," Nalina said. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the rail yard. She looked at the stockyards, where 200 head of longhorn steers were penned, waiting for the noon freight. "We need cover. We need chaos." She turned to Elia, who was rocking her child, who had begun to fuss. "Elia, Sani, you see the big gate, the one at the end of the loading chute?" Elia looked. She nodded, her face grim. She understood. "It opens onto the alley." "The alley opens onto the street," Nalina continued. "A lot of noise, a lot of dust. Can you do it?" Elia handed the cradle board to Isha Greyfeather. She stood up. She picked up a discarded iron grease bucket. "Yes." She and Sani slipped away, moving low and fast along the fence line, disappearing behind the mass of nervous cattle. "When it happens, we move," Nalina said to Silas. "You and I, for the marshal's office. The rest," she said to Tua, Marisol, and the others. "You scatter. You use the chaos. Do not fight. You hide. Meet at the water tower if we are separated. Go!" Silas and Nalina moved to the edge of the alley, their hearts pounding. They waited. It began with a bang, a sharp, metallic crack as Elia smashed the bucket against the gate's locking bar. Then a bang again, and a high, piercing shriek from Sani. The steers, already jumpy, surged. The gate, meant to hold them, shuddered. Elia hit it again. The latch bar popped. The gate exploded outward. It was not a stampede. It was a flood. A river of muscle, horn, and terrified bellows poured into the narrow alley. The man pretended to be drunk by the marshal's office jumped to his feet, his eyes wide. The hired guns at the freight office spun, drawing their pistols. The steers hit the main street. Dust bloomed instantly. a choking, blinding cloud of brown that swallowed the entire block. Shouts and curses were lost in the thunder of 200 hooves on hard-packed earth. "Now!" Silas yelled. He grabbed Nalina's hand and they ran. They burst from the alley, bent low, plunging into the heart of the dust cloud. The world was brown and roaring. A steer, its eyes white with panic, clipped Silas's shoulder, spinning him, but he held onto Nalina. They crossed the 50 yards of street in 10 seconds, invisible, their footsteps lost in the din. The man who had been guarding the marshal's office was gone, having climbed a porch railing to escape the cattle. They hit the office door. It was unlocked. Silas burst in, rifle first, Nalina right behind him, knife in hand. The office was empty, silent. The air was stale, smelling of cold cigar smoke and dust. "Ruth," Silas called out, his voice a rasp. No answer. He saw her hat on a peg by the door. He saw her shotgun in the rack. And on the desk, he saw her badge, the silver star. Just lying there? "It's a trap," Nalina whispered, her eyes scanning the room. "They took her." Silas felt his hope collapse. No, she'd never leave the star. He looked at the pot-bellied stove. The coffee pot on top was cold. She'd been gone for hours. Creak. The sound was faint. A single floorboard. From the back room, the room with the holding cells, Silas and Nalina spun as one. He leveled the Winchester. Nalina flattened herself against the wall. Knife held low. The back room door swung open. Slowly, a figure stepped out. A woman. She was holding a 12-gauge, double-barreled shotgun, and its twin muzzles were aimed low, steady as rock. She had fiery red hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes were the brightest, angriest blue Silas had ever seen. She wasn't pointing the gun at them. She was pointing it past them, at the front door. "Silas," she rasped. Her voice was like gravel. "You always did like making a racket. Took you long enough." "Ruth," Silas breathed. The name was a prayer. "Shut the door," Ruth Carver snapped, not looking at him. "And bar it." Silas slammed the door and dropped the heavy iron bar into place. Just as the first of the hired guns, his face grimed with dust, reached the porch. "Been pinned in this office since sunup," Ruth said, finally looking at them. She took in Nalina, her knife, her Apache dress, and then Silas. "Cole's men have this town locked tight. They cut the main telegraph line, but I've got my own wire to the army post. Not that they'll get here before spring." "Ruth, we—" Silas started. Nalina stepped forward, cutting him off. She held out the deerskin satchel. "We brought this—" Ruth's eyes narrowed. She looked at the satchel, then at Nalina. She lowered the shotgun. She took the satchel, pulled out the heavy, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of her flipping the pages. Her lips moved, reading the names, the figures. Her face, which had been pale with fatigue, flushed with a sudden, cold fury. "Forsyth and Cole," she whispered. "Hiram Cole. It's his signature." She kept turning. "Payouts, lost herds, scout patrols. He's been billing the army for his own mercenaries. He's been stealing my God. Silas, he's been stealing everything." She looked up, her bright eyes burning. "I've been trying to pin him for months, for theft, for illegal land grabs. But this is paper that can hang a man. This proves the Cinder Bluff fire. This proves the relocation at Red Draw." She looked at Silas, her eyes softening for just a second. "This proves Sarah." Thud, thud, thud. Heavy boots hit the boardwalk outside. The cattle were gone, the dust settling. "Marshal," a voice called out. "We know you're in there. Send out the rancher and the woman. This ain't your business." Ruth Carver moved. She didn't hesitate. She strode to the desk, grabbed the one-lit oil lamp, and with a sharp puff of breath, killed the flame. The office was plunged into near-total darkness. "They're fanning out," she whispered, peeking through the slats of the blinds. "5 of them. They saw you come in. They're coming for the book." She grabbed Silas's arm, her grip like a steel trap. "Basement," she commanded, shoving him toward the dark back room. "Now." Ruth Carver didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ledger from her desk, stuffed it back into the deerskin satchel, and slung it over her own shoulder. She motioned with the shotgun toward the back room. "The cells! Move!" They plunged into the darkness of the small jail. It held 2 empty, iron-barred cells, smelling of rust and despair. At the very back, hidden by a stack of old blankets, was a heavy timber trapdoor set into the floor. "Cole's men are thorough," Ruth whispered, her voice tight as she kicked the blankets aside. "But they ain't smart enough to know the history of this town." She looped her fingers through an iron ring and heaved. The door lifted, revealing a square of perfect, cold blackness. "Where does it go?" Silas asked. Peering down, a rush of cool, damp air rose to meet them, smelling of minerals and deep earth. Coal chute, the original one, from before the rail spur was finished. It hits a lava tube that runs right under the rail bed. It's how my daddy used to move prisoners when the vigilantes got rowdy. After you. Silas went first, sliding his rifle down ahead of him. He dropped into the chute, his boots hitting packed dirt and coal dust. He slid 10 feet, the darkness absolute, and landed on a floor of uneven, glassy, smooth rock. Nalina landed a second later, as silent as a cat, her hand immediately finding his arm in the dark to steady herself. Above, Ruth clicked on a heavy railroad lantern, its yellow beam cutting a hole in the gloom. "They're on the porch," she said, her voice echoing strangely. "They'll be through that door in 5 minutes." She closed the heavy trapdoor over their heads. The thud was a sound of final, profound isolation. The sounds of the world above the shouting. The boots were instantly muffled, distant. Ruth slid down the chute, the lantern in one hand, her shotgun in the other. She landed, the light swinging wildly, illuminating their prison. It was not a basement. It was a cavern, a natural lava tube, smooth-walled and high, arcing away into the darkness. The air was cool, almost cold, and echoed with a single, clear sound, drip, drip, drip. "This way," Ruth commanded, keeping her voice low. The echo was unnerving. A whisper sounded like a shout. "We move away from the chute. They might find it. They won't find us." She led them perhaps 50 yards into the oppressive dark. The floor was uneven, a glassy, rippled stone that felt strange under Silas's boots. The rail bed was directly above them, and the ground felt like it was vibrating, humming with the weight of the iron and the idling freight train. Ruth stopped, raising the lantern. They were in a wider pocket of the tube, a small alcove where the wall had collapsed inward, creating a space 10 feet deep, and in the corner, a thin, silver thread of water issued from a crack in the rock, spilling into a clear, shallow pool before vanishing into the black floor. "Here," Ruth said. She set the lantern on a flat rock, its light casting huge, dancing shadows. "We rest, we wait 'em out." "They can't stay on that street forever." She settled herself on a rock near the entrance of the alcove, facing back toward the chute, her shotgun resting across her knees. She was a sentry, a guardian. She was giving them the illusion of privacy. It was the first time they had stopped, the first time in 2 days they weren't running, fighting, or hiding. The silence, broken only by the drip of the water, descended like a heavy blanket, and with the silence, the crash came. Silas leaned his Winchester against the wall and sagged. He slid down the cool, smooth rock until he was sitting. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. It wasn't a tremor. It was a deep, uncontrollable vibration. A violent quake originating from his shoulders and channeling out through his fingers. The adrenaline, the sheer, terror-fueled energy that had carried him through the fight at the ranch and the chaos in the town, was now draining away, leaving a hollow, aching void. He tried to hide it. He balled his hands into fists, pressing them against his knees, ashamed. He was the builder, the man with the steady hands. Now he looked like a palsied old man. Nalina, who had been standing, watching the water seep, turned. She saw him. She saw the fists, the rigid set of his jaw, the sweat on his forehead. She moved, kneeling in front of him. She didn't speak. She just reached out and gently took his right hand. She uncurled his straining fingers, her own calloused, warm palm absorbing the tremor. "It is the body," she said, her voice so low it barely disturbed the air. "It is the body remembering it is alive. The fear comes after the danger. Let it—" She looked at his forearm. The linen wrap she had applied at the ranch was dark with grime and fresh blood from the climb. The stitches were holding, but the skin around them was angry. She reached into the small medicine pouch at her belt. From it, she pulled a strip of clean, white linen. He recognized it. It was from one of Sarah's old sewing chests, a chest he hadn't opened in 8 years. She had taken it, a small act of foresight that now felt like an incredible kindness. "This will be cold," she said. She uncorked a small canteen, wet the new linen, and began to unwrap the old one. Her fingers were impossibly gentle. When she had stitched his arm, her touch had been the quick, impersonal efficiency of a field surgeon. This was different. This was deliberate. This was care. He hissed as the cold, wet cloth touched the raw wound, but her hand was steady on his arm, holding him still. "You have not felt this in a long time," she observed, her eyes on her work. "What?" he rasped, his throat tight. "The fear. The fight." She began to wrap the clean linen, her movements fluid and practiced. "You lived in a quiet place. 8 winters," he confirmed, his voice hollow. "I built the ranch to be quiet. I thought if I kept the world out, I could keep the ghosts in, keep them safe." "Ghosts do not need safety," she said, smoothing the linen. "They need to be heard." "Mine were quiet," he said, staring at her hands. "Until you came." She finished the wrap, tying it off with a firm, neat knot. But she did not let go of his arm. Her hand rested on his wrist. "My people," she began, her voice a near whisper. "We do not have the luxury of quiet. Our ghosts walk with us. They are in the wind. They are in the cry of the hawk." She looked up, her dark eyes finding his in the dim, yellow lantern light. "You stayed still to honor your loss. My people, we must keep moving to honor ours. If we stop, we are erased. What kept you alive?" "Silas," was the silence. "What kept us alive was the noise, the moving, the baby's cry, the promise of the next step." It was then he understood. He had built a tomb. She was the leader of a procession. They were 2 maps of grief, drawn by different hands, but they had led to this exact spot. He realized his hands had stopped shaking. She saw it too. A small, faint smile touched her lips. She raised her free hand, her fingers still damp, and gently brushed his cheek. He flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement, his skin unused to a touch that was not his own. She paused, her fingers hovering. He saw the soot on her fingertips, smudged from the coal chute. She had brushed away a streak of it from his face. "Still," she said. He nodded, and she completed the gesture, her touch a strange, electric thing on his skin. As she pulled her hand back, the lantern light caught the side of her face. He saw it for the first time, a thin, perfect crescent scar, just below her jawline, pale against her skin. It was old. It was earned. His fingers, no longer shaking, rose. He mirrored her gesture, his thumb tracing the air, just above the mark. "And you." Her smile faded. Her hand went to the scar. "A reminder. From a long time ago. A reminder that trust is a blade with 2 edges, and that I heal." The simple, profound statement hung in the air between them. He felt a powerful, aching need to close the small distance, to tell her what. He didn't have the words. He remembered his pack. He fumbled with the straps, pulling out the small cloth bag of dried peaches. He held one out to her. She took it. He took one for himself. They ate in silence. The fruit was leathery, tough, but the flavor exploded in their mouths, intensely sweet, a shocking burst of summer sunshine in the cold. Subterranean dark. He watched her eat, the way her eyes closed for just a moment, savoring the taste, sweet on their tongues. And as he watched her, the way he looked at her changed. The sweetness was in his eyes, too. She was no longer just an ally. She was no longer just a leader. She was Nalina. A low, deep rumble began. It was not thunder. It was the rail bed, directly above them. The noon freight was finally moving. The ground beneath them vibrated, and the rumble grew into a deafening, grinding roar. Dust sifted from the ceiling, glittering in the lantern light. Instinctively, they leaned closer, drawn together by the overwhelming sound, as if to create a small, shared pocket of humanity against the crushing weight of the world above. The noise was immense, filling the tube, shaking the very rock they sat on. And then, as quickly as it came, it faded. The roar receded, leaving a silence that was heavier, more profound than before. They were still leaning close. His knee was pressed against hers. He could smell the sage from her clothes, the clean, mineral scent of the cave, and the lingering sweetness of the peaches on her breath. He looked at her mouth. He had to ask. After 8 years of solitude, after his confession of failure, he could not, would not, simply take. He would not be that man. Nalina, he whispered. His voice was thick, unrecognizable. He lifted his hand, the one she had bandaged. He stopped, his fingers hovering an inch from her face, his eyes asking the question his voice could not form. She looked at his hand. She looked at his eyes, which were filled with a raw, painful, patient question. She saw the respect in his hesitation. She saw the man who had opened his door when he could have kept it barred. She nodded. Once. A clear, deliberate, undeniable movement. She closed that final inch. His fingers touched her cheek. His skin was rough against hers. He leaned in, and the first kiss was slow. It was a question. It was tentative, a discovery of dry lips and shared breath. It tasted of dust and peaches. Then she answered. Her hand came up, her palm finding his shoulder, her fingers gripping the thick wool of his shirt. The kiss deepened. It was not the fast, hot hunger of youth. It was the deep, desperate, grateful press of two survivors who had chosen warmth over the cold. It was a quiet yes. His other arm went around her, his hand spreading wide across her back, pulling her closer, their bodies pressed together, a solid, grounding warmth passing between them. Through the layers of buckskin and wool and leather, there was no rush, there was no fumbling. It was just heat, and the quiet sound of their breathing, and a silent promise to fight for the morning. He broke the kiss, but only to rest his forehead against hers. Their eyes were closed. The lantern light painted them in soft gold. Nalina, he murmured, his breath brushing her lips. He said her name like a vow, like a prayer he had forgotten he knew. Silas, she answered, her own voice thick. She said his name like a homecoming, like the first word spoken after 8 long years of silence. They stayed like that, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. The world outside, the men, the guns. Hiram coal had all evaporated. There was only the drip of the water and the heat of their bodies. Scrape, thud. The sound was sharp, metallic, directly above them. From the marshal's office, they froze. The moment shattered. Boots, heavy, walking across the wooden floor of the office. A voice, muffled, but angry. They didn't spring apart. They held on, their foreheads resting together for one heartbeat longer. A shared, silent breath. A promise. Ruth was already moving. Her hand snuffed the lantern's flame, plunging the lava tube into an absolute, cold, terrifying blackness. Still, Ruth's voice hissed from the dark. A sharp, cold splinter. Don't move. Don't even breathe. Silas and Nalina separated, but their hands found each other in the dark, a desperate, anchoring grip, when the footsteps above finally faded, and Ruth clicked the lantern back on. Its light was dim. The wick turned low. They rose to their feet. They stood side by side, not touching, but the air between them had been forged into something new. They were no longer just allies. They were partners. The tenderness, the desperate heat of the last few minutes was not gone. It was banked, like hot coals buried under ash, ready to be carried forward, ready to burn again when the long night was finally over. The blackness of the lava tube was absolute, a cold, mineral-smelling void. The footsteps above had faded, but the silence they left behind was worse. It was the silence of a hunter waiting. "They're guarding the door," Ruth Carver's voice hissed from the dark. "They'll wait for us to come up for air, but they don't know the old ways." She clicked the railroad lantern back on, but kept the flame turned low, a smoky yellow eye that barely pierced the gloom. She led them, not back up the coal chute, but deeper into the earth. The air grew colder, the dripping of the water more pronounced, echoing as if they were in a great, hollow drum. "Where are we going?" Silas whispered, his voice sounding too loud. "The town was built on these tubes," Ruth replied, not looking back. "The first settlers used them as cellars. Most are sealed off. One isn't." They walked for what felt like a mile, their boots scraping on the glassy, uneven stone. The air grew stale, but then a new smell, damp earth, rotted wood, and faintly, the high, thin scent of the stockyards. Ruth stopped, raising the lantern. Ahead of them was a crude, crumbling wall of fieldstone, and in it, a rotted wooden door, its hinges long since rusted away. "An old homesteader's cellar," Ruth said. "He built his house on top of it. The house burned down 20 years ago. The town built around it, but the cellar is still here." She pushed the door. It collapsed inward in a cloud of dust and splinters, revealing a narrow set of stone steps, slick with moss. They climbed, emerging from the ground into the gray, dying light of afternoon. They were in a ruined foundation, overgrown with weeds, hidden behind the massive water tower at the edge of the rail yard. And they were not alone. "Nalina," a voice whispered. Tua, Sani, and the other 8 women materialized from the shadows of the tower. Elia was there, the baby safe in her arms, her face pale but resolute. The reunion was silent, a desperate exchange of nods, a counting of heads. All safe. Ruth moved to the edge of the ruin, peering toward the marshal's office. "They've got men on the roof. They'll be watching the roads." She knelt, picking up a small, discarded tin can and a sharp-edged piece of gravel. Tap, 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 tap. She struck the can with a stone. A sharp, a rhythmic pattern. Silas looked at her. "What is that?" "My deputies, Abe and Malachi. They're good men. They're camped south, waiting for my signal. That's old telegraph code. It means Whisper Lake. All hell's broke loose." "Whisper Lake?" Nalina asked, joining them, her eyes on the horizon. "An alkali pan, 10 miles south," Ruth said, her face grim, bright as a bleached bone. "It's the last place on earth you want to be, which is why they'll never expect us to go there." They didn't have time to argue. They moved, using the long shadows of the grain elevators and the noise of the stockyards. They stole 6 horses from the livery, a necessary, hard choice. They rode south, not hard, but steady. The 11 of them Silas, Ruth, and the 9 Apache women. With Elia and the child riding double with Isha Greyfeather, they cleared the town limits, and they saw it. It was not the posse from the ranch. It was not the city slicker gunmen. It was a polished black coach, pulled by 4 magnificent bay horses, moving at a calm, steady trot. It was keeping pace with them. Half a mile back, flanking it, were 8 riders, the same men from Mallow Junction. Nalina reined in, her eyes narrowing. "He is not chasing." Silas felt a cold dread. He shielded his eyes against the low sun. Through the coach window, he could see the glint of sunlight on a man's starched white shirt and the unmistakable shape of a high-crowned white hat. Hiram Cole. Silas breathed. "It's him. He's not chasing," Nalina repeated, her voice like ice. "He is hurting us. He wants us in the open. He wants us at the lake." "Then that's where we'll spring the trap," Ruth said, her jaw set. She kicked her horse. "Ride." Whisper Lake was a desolate, terrible beauty. a vast, circular pan of dried alkali, 5 miles wide. It shimmered in the setting sun like a sheet of hammered silver. The air above it was alive, a rippling, liquid heat that distorted the landscape. There was no cover, no rocks, no trees, just a blinding, bone-white flatness. At the far edge, on a low ridge, 2 figures on horseback waved. "Abe and Malachi," Ruth said, relief flooding her voice. "Good, we have rifles." "Ruth, this is a kill box," Silas said, his horse shifting nervously, unwilling to step onto the bright, strange ground. "No," Nalina said. She had dismounted, her moccasins sinking slightly into the soft, crusty salt. She looked across the shimmering expanse. "It is a stage." She held up her hand. The air was unnaturally still. She whispered, "Tua." Her voice, barely a breath, seemed to leap across the pan, echoing back at them. "Sound," Nalina said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Sound travels, and the heat it makes the eye lie." She turned, her authority absolute. "We will not hide. We will look big." She began to give orders. "Pahana, Rowena, Isha, take the horses. Hide them in that arroyo with the deputies. Elia, you and the child. With them. Go!" To the others, Tua, Sani, Marisol, Tala, and Blue Star, she pointed. "Spread out, a wide crescent, 100 yards between each of you. Take the blankets, the shawls, drape them on the sagebrush. Make them look like men." She handed Marisol her small mirror shard. "Use this. Flash the sun. Make them think we have metal. Make them think we have rifles." In minutes, the 10 women of the original group, minus Alia, were a wide, silent arc. In the shimmering heat, the shawls looked like kneeling warriors. The glint of the mirrors looked like a line of 50 rifles. Silas, meanwhile, was working with the supplies from his saddlebag. He had his saltpeter. He had the sulfur. He mixed it with the oily, pungent sagebrush that dotted the lake's edge. He built 3 smoke pots, just as Elia had. "They expect us to run," Silas said to Ruth, his hands black with the mixture. "They expect us to hide. They won't expect us to make a wall of smoke." He looked at Nalina, who was now standing at the center of her phantom army. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't need to ask. He knew what she needed. Ghost riders. Hiram Cole's polished coach rolled to a stop at the edge of the pan. His 8 gunmen fanned out, their rifles ready. They looked nervous, staring at the wide, silent arc of figures. Hiram Cole himself stepped from the coach. He was a tall man, immaculate in a black city suit. His white hat was pristine. He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve and smiled, a smug, confident expression. He raised a speaking trumpet. "Marshal Carver," his voice boomed across the flat, unnaturally loud. "A true pleasure to see you. I admire your persistence." Ruth stepped forward, her shotgun held low. "Hiram Cole," she yelled back, and her own voice carried, sharp and clear. "By the authority of the United States Marshal Service, you are under arrest." Cole laughed. It was a rich, booming sound that made the air tremble. Arrest me, ma'am. You are interrupting vital commerce. You are standing in the way of progress. I am operating under contracts sanctioned by the United States government. What I do for patriotism." He then turned, his voice softening, becoming almost fatherly. He addressed the silent, blanket-draped figures. "And to the natives," he called, "my sincere apologies for the inconvenience at Cinder Bluff. A simple misunderstanding. Forsyth and Cole are prepared to make restitution, full compensation." "What does that mean?" Ruth muttered. "He means," Nalina called out, her voice cutting through the air like a knife, "a new fire to burn the evidence and cash to silence us." Cole's smile widened. "A smart woman. Yes, we will erase this mistake. $1,000 in gold coin for your trouble, and for the ledger, just return the ledger, and you can all go free." Ruth raised her shotgun. "The time for talk is over. Cole, tell your men to lay down their arms." Cole's face darkened. The smile vanished. "I tried to be reasonable." He dropped the speaking trumpet and barked at his men. "Fools! There are 10 of them. On foot. They are trying to bluff. Rush them! Get the book! Get all of them!" 6 of the gunmen spurred their horses, yelling, charging the center of the crescent. "Now! Silas!" Nalina screamed. Silas put a match to the 3 smoke pots. With a sound like tearing silk. 3 massive plumes of thick, oily white smoke, pungent with sage, erupted from the ground. The wind, coming off the ridge, pushed the smoke low, enveloping the charging riders. They yelled, their horses rearing in panic as the world vanished. And then they hit the sink crusts. The center of the pan, which looked solid, was a lie. It was a thin crust of alkali over a foot of thick, grasping, salty mud. The horses screamed as their legs punched through, sinking to their knees. Riders were thrown. Men on foot who had charged in stumbled, their boots swallowed, their ankles sinking. Their tempers sank faster. They were trapped, blind in the smoke, and stuck fast. "It's a trap," one of them bellowed, trying to pull his boot free. From the hard edge of the pan, Tua stood. She was not a ghost. She was a warrior. In her hand, she whirled a simple rawhide sling. A man in the smoke raised his pistol, firing blindly. Tua's arm blurred. The rock she slung cracked against the man's wrist with a sickening thwack, and his pistol vanished into the mud. Another gunman, still on his struggling horse, managed to raise his rifle. Sani's lariat, which she had been building in her hands, snaked out. The loop settled perfectly over his shoulders. She and Marisol dug in their heels and pulled. He was plucked from the saddle, landing hard on the safe crust. The wind knocked out of him. In seconds, he was disarmed and his hands were tied. Cole, his face purple with rage, screamed at his 2 remaining men by the coach. "Shoot! Shoot them! Open fire!" The 2 men raised their rifles. 2 shots cracked from the ridge. Abe and Malachi. Dirt kicked up at the gunmen's feet. They dove for cover behind the coach. Cole made a decision. He turned to run, to get back into the coach and tell the driver to flee. "No, you don't!" Silas roared. He was on his horse, a wild man, his face grimed with soot. He kicked the animal, galloping out onto the pan's edge. He wasn't charging the men. He was cutting the line. He rode hard and fast, a blur of motion, positioning himself between Cole and the coach, drawing their fire. The gunman behind the coach opened up on him. Dirt geysers erupted from the white alkali, bullets spraying the ground where his horse's hooves had just been. He was screaming, a raw, primal sound of 8 years of grief and rage finally given a voice. He was no longer hiding, but all eyes were on him. No one was watching Nalina. She had used the chaos. Sprinting low, she ran, not at Cole, but at the coach. The driver was frantically whipping the horses, trying to turn the heavy vehicle. Cole had his hand on the door, trying to climb in. Nalina didn't slow. She drew her long knife. With a powerful, upward thrust, she didn't stab the man. She didn't cut the horses. She drove the blade, with all her strength, deep into the solid rubber tire of the massive rear wheel. Pop! The knife blade stuck. The tire tore, locking the wheel. The coach, lurching forward at a turn, broke its axle with a sound like a pistol shot. The entire vehicle tipped, groaning, and collapsed onto its side. Hiram Cole was thrown clear. He tumbled, not with dignity, but like a sack of grain, his fine coat tearing, his white hat flying from his head. He landed face first in the white, salty grit of the alkali flat. The fight was over. The gunmen in the mud had their hands up. The 2 by the coach, their escape route gone, threw down their rifles as Ruth, Abe, and Malachi advanced. Silas reined in his horse. It was shaking, its sides heaving, lathered in sweat. Hiram Cole pushed himself up, spitting salty mud. His face was a mask of white grit and black fury. His suit was ruined. Ruth Carver walked toward him, her shotgun never wavering. She stopped 3 feet from him. "Hiram Cole," she said, her voice quiet, but it carried across the suddenly silent pan. "You have the right to remain silent." She holstered her pistol, took the iron cuffs from her belt. She yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs locking was the only sound. It was the sound of a bill. 8 years overdue, finally being paid. "You fool!" Cole snarled, his voice a ragged whisper. He was shaking with rage. "You goddamn fool! Do you think this stops anything? Do you think this—" He spat. "Is the company. The company is bigger than one man. You can't arrest a railroad." "He's right," Nalina said. She had walked up, her knife back in its sheath. The ledger, which Ruth had dropped to make the arrest, back in her hand. Silas dismounted, joining them. "He's right," Ruth agreed. She looked at Cole, then at the ledger in Nalina's hand. "This little fish is caught," but the ledger shows the bigger name behind him, the one who's been pulling all the strings. Nalina opened the book to the last few pages, the ones with the largest, most secret payouts, the ones authorized with a different signature. Silas leaned in. He read the name. Ruth read the name. It wasn't Hiram Cole. It was a name Silas recognized from the old freight contracts, a name that meant power, the Army, and the iron fist of the railroad, Colonel Everett Langford. The air at Whisper Lake was thick with the stench of alkali mud and the bitter, metallic taste of an unfinished fight. Hiram Cole, cuffed and his fine suit ruined, was a trophy, but not a victory. Nalina held the ledger. Ruth Carver stared at the final, damning signature. Colonel Everett Langford. "The Army," Ruth said, her voice flat. She looked at her 2 deputies, Abe and Malachi, who were rounding up Cole's defeated gunmen. "This ain't just freight theft anymore. This is military. He'll have 100 men. He'll have the wire. He'll have the railroad." "He knows," Silas said, the realization dawning on him. He looked at Cole, who was now staring at them with a smug, hateful look. Cole was supposed to meet them. He's late. Langford will know he failed. He'll move to cut his losses, Nalina added, her gaze fixed on the northern horizon. He'll move to destroy the proof and the witnesses. "The trestle," Silas breathed. The name felt like iron in his mouth. "Devil's Ribbon Trestle. All those phantom shipments, all the lost herd counts, he greenlit them. The paperwork all began and ended at that bridge. It's his weak point. He'll be on the move right now," Ruth said, her mind racing. "He'll send a patrol, seize the bridge, cut the wires, and wait for us." She looked at her deputies. "He'll send a train. Then we have to get there first." Nalina said there was no more talk. They were a single unit, a strange army of 9 Apache women, 1 hermit rancher, and 3 youths. Marshals, facing down the U.S. Army. They left Cole and his men cuffed, hog-tied, and under the guard of Malachi. "Fire 2 shots if they even breathe wrong," Ruth ordered. "We'll be back, or we won't." They rode. They rode north, pushing their horses hard. The setting sun at their backs, racing the telegraph wire, racing the inevitable military patrol rattling toward the canyon. They reached Devil's Ribbon at moonrise. It was a terrifying sight, a skeletal spiderweb of black iron and timber, spanning a 3,000-foot drop. The canyon below was a river of absolute, windless black. "My God," Abe whispered, reining in his horse. "It's a fortress." Silas dismounted. He walked to the edge, his boots crunching on the gravel of the rail bed. He put his hand on the first massive iron support. "I know this bridge," he said, his voice quiet, almost a reverie. Nalina and Ruth joined him, the women fanning out, securing the perimeter. "Before," Silas said, his hand tracing a rivet pattern. "Before I went to Silverthorne, I was on the crew. I helped bolt this thing together. I sweated, I bled onto this iron." He looked up. Not at the bridge, but at the far side, barely visible. "I know its strengths, and I know I remember its one great weakness." "Can we blow it?" Ruth asked, her voice grim. "We've got the dynamite from Cole's coach." "No," Silas said, shaking his head. "We blow it. The train goes into the canyon. We kill 30 men to catch one. We become murderers. And the ledger, the evidence, it all burns with him. We become the very thing he'll claim we are." "We don't kill," Nalina said, stepping to his side. She put her hand on the iron, next to his. We stop, we trap, like we did at the ranch. Silas looked at her, then at the bridge, his builder's mind seeing the schematics, the stress points, the load balances. The center deck, it's a single, 80-foot span. It's locked in place with 4-inch steel shear pins. It's designed to be removed, for repairs. He pointed. If we get under it, if we can pull those pins, the entire section will be unmoored. The train rolls onto it. It falls, Ruth said. No, Silas countered. It sags, the undertruss, the safety lattice. It'll catch it. It's designed to, but it'll drop. Maybe 6, maybe 7 feet. It'll drop and it will lock. It'll stop the train dead, high in the air. It'll trap them. A seesaw of steel, Nalina whispered, seeing the vision. But we have to be under it, Silas said. The true danger of the plan settling on them. We'll be on the lattice, 1,000 feet up. When it drops. It's a plan, Ruth said, her face set. It's the only one we've got. She turned to Abe. Abe, you're the smallest. Get across. Now. Take the axle grease from the wagon. Grease the far rail. Starting 200 yards out. We need that engineer to brake. We need him slowing down before he hits the center. Abe nodded, his face pale, and vanished into the darkness. Nalina, Silas said. Your women, Marisol, Rowena, they're climbers. They're fast. Nalina nodded. Marisol and I. We'll take the east side. Rowena has the best eyes. She stays on the ridge, with the bow, to watch. I'll take the west side, Silas said. I'll need a crow's wrench, a heavy one. They moved. Abe was a ghost, a shadow on the far side of the bridge. The wind was high, whistling through the iron lattice, a high, lonely, terrifying sound. Silas, Nalina, and Marisol began the climb. They swung down from the deck, their hands and feet finding purchase on the cold, cross-braced iron. Below them was nothing, just air. Silas's hands, which had trembled in the lava tube, were rock steady. This was his work. This was iron and stress. This was what he knew. He moved with a builder's confidence, his body remembering the feel of the lattice. He found his spot, just under the massive joint, and braced himself. He had the heavy wrench tied to his wrist. Across the span, he could just see the silhouettes of Nalina and Marisol, braced against the iron. 2 small, determined spiders on a vast web. They waited. An hour passed. The moon slid behind a cloud. Then, a new sound. A vibration that came through the iron itself, humming in Silas's bones. A distant whistle. Chuff. A single headlight cut the darkness, miles away. But coming fast, it was a military patrol. A heavy locomotive, pushing 1 flat car, followed by a single passenger car. Silas watched it come. He could see the soldiers now. Shadows on the flat car, huddled against the wind, and at the front, 1 man, standing alone, his long coat flapping, Langford. The train hit the greased rail. Scree! The sound was a violation. The locomotive's brakes screamed. A terrifying, high-pitched shriek that echoed off the canyon walls. A shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted from the wheels. A sudden, violent script of fire in the daylight bright beam of the headlamp. The train lurched. Its speed cut in half, but it was still coming. It was still heavy. It crawled onto the bridge, the whole structure groaning under the new weight. On the flat car, Langford was furious. He was screaming at the engineer. He was braced against the wind, his voice faint but clear. Order, we are here to restore. His speech died. The bridge's hum changed. The vibration turned sour. A deep, sickening thrum. Langford grabbed a stanchion. He felt it. He knew something was wrong. The heavy engine cleared the center section. The flat car, with Langford and his 30 rifles, was now sitting perfectly, squarely, in the trap. Fweet! Ruth's whistle, high and sharp, from the ridge. It was the signal. Now! Silas roared, his voice swallowed by the wind. He jammed the crow's wrench into the locking wedge and threw his entire body, all his weight, all his grief, into the motion. Shh! Krang! The metal shrieked. The wedge popped free, across the way. Nalina and Marisol, hanging in the void, put their feet against the truss and pulled as one. The massive, 4-inch thick steel pin slid from its housing with a oily, sucking thud. For one heart-stopping second, there was silence. Then, a groan of steel and torment. The entire 80-foot section of track beneath Langford's feet, the flat car, the soldiers, the colonel himself dropped. It fell with a sickening, stomach-lurching lurch. 6 feet, 7. Then, with a crash that shook the canyon, it slammed into the safety catches of the undertruss and locked. The flat car tilted, a horrifying seesaw of steel. Soldiers were thrown to the deck. They screamed. Rifles clattered. The locomotive, its drive wheels spinning uselessly over the gap, hissed in fury. The passenger car, still on the main deck, was wrenched violently. They were trapped, 30 soldiers, a colonel, and a locomotive, stuck harmlessly on a broken bridge, 1,000 feet in the air. Shots cracked. The soldiers, panicking, began firing wildly into the night, their muzzle flashes lighting the canyon, the bullets ricocheting off the iron with high-pitched whines. The canyon walls threw the soundback, amplifying the dozen shots into a full-scale war. "Colonel Langford," Ruth Carver's voice boomed from the near ridge. She stepped into the headlight's beam, her badge glinting, her shotgun raised. "This is Deputy Hughes. Marshal Carver, you are trapped. Your men will lay down their arms." Langford, on the tilted deck, was a portrait of fury. He was still on his horse, which was screaming and bucking, its eyes white with terror. He fought the animal, regaining his balance. He saw Ruth. He saw Silas and Nalina climbing up from the truss, pulling themselves onto the stable section of the deck. He saw the deerskin satchel in Nalina's hand. He knew it was over. He was a cornered animal. He snarled, yanking at his saddlebag. Not for a gun, for a way out. He pulled out a tin flask and a match. He was going to burn the ledger, burn the women, burn the bridge if he had to. He uncorked the flask, dousing the satchel in Nalina's hand with oil. "Burn in hell!" he screamed, and struck the match. The small flame flared, bright and sulphurous, in his hand. Thwip! An arrow, silent as a thought, crossed the 100-yard gap from the far ridge. It did not strike his flesh. It did not hit the horse. It passed perfectly through the heavy wool of his sleeve, just above the wrist, and stitched his arm, the one holding the match, firmly to the high leather-wrapped cantle of his saddle. The match dropped. His arm was pinned. He stared at the feathered shaft, his mouth open, in stunned disbelief. On the far ridge, Rowena slowly, deliberately, lowered her bow. All shooting stopped. The soldiers, now quiet, stared at their colonel, pinned by an arrow to his own saddle, on a broken bridge, in the middle of a dark canyon. Silas Hartwell, his face black with grease and soot, walked forward. He took the ledger from Nalina's steady hand. He walked to the edge of the gap, the wind tearing at his clothes. He held the book up. "This book is full of names. Colonel," he called out, his voice clear and ringing in the sudden quiet. "The names of phantom shipments, the names of herds you lost." Langford yanked at his pinned arm, his face purple. "But there are other names," Silas continued, his voice rising. "Names that aren't written down. I know them. I know Sarah Hartwell. I know Eli Hartwell. They died in a canyon you filled with terror. They died so you could sign another page in this book." He stepped closer, staring across the 6-foot gap at the trapped, defeated man. "You didn't just steal from the army. Langford, you bought your entire life with graves." Langford's arrogance finally shattered. His jaw began to shake. It wasn't rage. It was the cold, abject terror of a man who had been caught. Ruth Carver walked up, her cuffs in her hand. "Colonel Everett Langford," she said, her voice like iron. "You are under arrest, for conspiracy, for theft, and for murder by proxy." "You can't," Langford howled, his voice cracking. "I am the law. I am the army." "No," Ruth said. "You're just a thief, and your men know it." She turned. "Abe, bring him up." Abe emerged from the shadows, dragging a terrified man in spectacles. His pay clerk, the one they'd grabbed in Mallow Junction trying to burn the freight records. "This is the colonel's clerk," Ruth announced, her voice carrying to every soldier on the flat car. "He's already confessed." She handed the clerk a page from the ledger. "Read it." "I can't," the man whimpered. "Read it," Ruth commanded. The clerk, his voice shaking, read the charges aloud for the soldiers to hear. October 10th, 1871 payout, $4,000 to Hiram Cole for Apache pacification. He read another. November 3rd, loss of equipment at Devil's Ribbons, $6,000 authorized, E. Langford. The soldiers on the car looked at each other. They looked at their colonel, pinned to his saddle by an arrow. They were not guarding an officer. They were guarding a criminal. Slowly, one by one, they laid their rifles on the deck. The journey back from Devil's Ribbon was slow, grim, and triumphant. They rode as an honor guard, a strange procession of one rancher, 3 marshals, and 9 Apache women, leading a disarmed military locomotive backward into Mallow Junction. The 30 shamed soldiers were held on the flat car by their own fear, their own disgust, and the watchful, unblinking eyes of Rowena and Tua, who rode on the engine's tender. When they arrived, the town was silent. It was just past dawn. The townsfolk, who had cowered behind locked doors during the cattle stampede, now emerged, drawn by the impossible sight of a military train being driven by a civilian. They saw Colonel Everett Langford, his arm still pinned to his saddle, his face a mask of gray, defeated fury. They saw Hiram Cole, his fine suit caked in white alkali mud, hauled from a horse and thrown into one of his own freight wagons. His hands bound, they saw the 8 gunmen, tied and disarmed, looking at the ground. Ruth Carver, her face grimed with soot and her badge shining in the new morning light, stood on the porch of her office. She didn't make a speech. She didn't have to. She took the ledger. She tore out the last, most damning 3 pages, the ones with Langford's and Cole's signatures, the ones that proved the conspiracy. She took a hammer and a nail from her desk. She walked to the town's main message post, the one place where all notices were read, and in front of the assembled, silent crowd. She nailed the papers to the post. Whack, whack, whack. The sound was an arraignment. It was an execution. It was the sound of a secret, 8 years old, finally being told in the daylight. People surged forward. They read the names. They read the figures. They read the lies, Apache pacification, lost herds. They looked at the pale, terrified clerk, who was now under Abe's guard. They looked at the cuffed colonel. The fear that had held Mallow Junction in its grip for 2 years did not just break, it shattered. By noon, a federal judge was on the wire. By 3 o'clock, the Forsyth Coal Freight Office, the one with the fresh paint, was shuttered. Its windows were dark. Its doors were locked. A new sign was nailed to the front, closed, by order of the U.S. Marshal Service. In the chaos, Nalina and the women had vanished. They had gone back to the ruined foundation by the water tower, their movements unseen, their presence no longer the town's business. Ruth found them there, sitting in a quiet circle, mending their moccasins, the baby sleeping peacefully in Alia's arms. Ruth sat down, her body aching. "It's done," she said. "Langford and Cole are on a train to the territorial prison. The Army is sending its own investigators. The ledger, it's federal evidence now." She looked at Nalina. "And you are free to go." Nalina looked up. "Free? That is a white man's word. It means we are free to be hunted by the next man. Free to starve." "No," Ruth said, her voice fierce. She unrolled a parchment. "Not this time." She had been busy. "I've wired the Sage Willow Agency. The agent there is a good man. These," she said, tapping the paper, "are protection orders, signed by me, authorized by the judge. They name every one of you. They state that you are under the protection of the Marshal Service, as material witnesses to a federal crime." She handed another packet to Isha Greyfeather. "These are food vouchers, enough to see you through the winter, and I am posting Abe and Malachi to escort you all the way to Sage Willow." Nalina studied the paper. She looked at Ruth. "You have used your power. For us. You gave me the power, Ruth said, tapping the now copied ledger at her hip. You gave me the paper to hang the crooks. It's only right the paper keeps you safe. She stood. There are others. From Cinder Bluff. They heard the news on the wire. They are riding in. They will meet you here. As if summoned, a small group of riders appeared at the edge of town. They were not women. They were 2 old men, 3 boys, and a handful of other survivors. They were all that was left of Cinder Bluff. The reunion was not loud. It was a low, desperate, grateful thing. Tears were shed, but they were tears of relief. Not just grief. Songs were sung, low and ancient. Carved tokens changed hands. The baby was passed from Elia's arms into the arms of an old man who wept as he held him. The 10 women, who had been a solitary fighting unit, were now a community again. Their grief was shared, and in that sharing, it became direction. They would go to Sage Willow. They would rebuild. Silas Hartwell watched from a distance. He was standing by his mule. Old Hezekiah. He did not belong to this. He was the outsider, the hermit, the man who had only opened the door. Nalina separated from the group and walked to him. The setting sun cast their shadows long on the dusty ground. They stood in silence for a long time, the sounds of the reunion a soft murmur behind them. "You are going," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "My people are here, and my place is back at the ranch." He looked at her. His hands, the hands that had stitched leather and pulled triggers and held hers in the dark, twisting the mule's rope. "The windmill. I need to see if it still turns." She looked at him, a long, deep, assessing gaze. "I will walk with you," she said, "to the edge of the wash." They walked out of Mallow Junction, away from the railroad, away from the celebration, away from the jail. They walked for a mile, back toward the high, lonely rim of Red Mesa Wash. When they crested the last ridge, Silverthorne Ranch lay below them, just as he had left it. It was quiet. It was empty. The door was still open, but the wind, coming down from the high plains, had caught the blades of the windmill, and it was turning. A slow, steady, rhythmic creak. It was the sound of water being drawn. It was the sound of life. "It turns," Silas whispered. He felt a profound sense of peace. The tomb was a home again. He looked at Nalina. "It's a good ranch. The water is sweet. The land is high. It's safe." "It is," she agreed. "I don't need it," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not all of it. Not alone. I want you to have it, you and the others, as a trust, a place to be safe, a gift for what you did for me." He was offering her the deed. He was offering her his home, out of guilt, out of gratitude, out of a desperate need to repay a debt. Nalina turned. She put her hand on his chest, her palm flat over his heart. "No," she said, her voice gentle, but firm as iron. He was stunned. "But we do not accept land gifted out of guilt. Silas, we are not your ghosts to appease. We are not your penance." She saw the hurt in his eyes, and her voice softened. "A partnership that is different. A gift makes a debt. A partnership makes a future." "A partnership. A way station," she said, her eyes glowing with the idea. "You are a builder. We are survivors. Travelers need a safe place to cross. A place that is not Forsyth and Cole. A place that is not a lie." She pointed. "We will call it Hartwell Crossing. We will build a corral. We will build a trading post. We will build a school. A school tent first, then wood." "A school," he said, bewildered. "For the children. For my people. To learn the new ways. And to remember the old. A corral second," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "Decent coffee mandatory." He laughed. It was a real laugh, a sound that startled him. "Decent coffee. Yes, we will build it together," she said. "A partnership, 50-50. We build tomorrow." He looked at her, at the strength in her face, at the future she was offering him. Not forgiveness for his past, but a use for it. He reached up, his calloused fingers touching the beaded strip in her hair. She had threaded it herself, a pattern of blue and white. Then we seal it," he said. He took the strip of rawhide he'd been braiding on the long walk. It was from his saddle strings. He held her wrist. It was slender, but strong as steel. He tied the rawhide around it. He didn't tie a knot of possession. He tied a builder's knot, a slip knot, the kind you use to bind a heavy load, the kind that holds under pressure but can be released with a single, knowing pull. "A builder's knot," he explained, his voice thick. "It's easy to untie." She looked at the knot, then at him, her eyes soft. "And easier to retie?" She rose on her toes. He bent his head. Their kiss, there on the rim of the wash, was not like the desperate, fevered one in the darkness. This was slow. It was a promise. It tasted of alkali dust, of the long trail, and faintly, of the cinnamon-laced coffee they had shared in the cottonwood grove. His rough, scarred hands fit in hers, his fingers lacing with hers. And for the first time in 8 years, Silas Hartwell felt his hands, not as tools of penance, but as the hands of a man. "We make tomorrow," he whispered, his promise against her lips. "We make tomorrow," she vowed. Ruth Carver, her prisoners and the ledger copies secure, rode out of Mallow Junction, her 2 deputies beside her. She looked back at the town, at the shuttered freight office, at the paper nailed to the post. "Paper hangs crooks," she said to Abe, "but people keep each other safe." The last image of that long, hard day was not of a jail cell or a broken bridge. It was at Silverthorne Ranch, by the light of a single lantern, swinging from the now turning windmill, its light a beacon, a new star drawing travelers in, a new life beginning. 10 women and 1 rancher were hammering. They were building the first school bench, their laughter echoing in the moonlight. Years later, children Apache, settler, their faces a mix of freckles and sun-darkened skin, would ride their ponies along the high ridges. They would stop and point, not at the ranch, but at the dark, distant scar of Devil's Ribbon, and they would tell the story. They would tell how a bridge was bent to justice, not by dynamite, but by a builder's mind. And they would tell how love staked a claim, not in the ground, but in a shared future, a claim that no thief, no army, and no ghost could ever steal. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please drop a comment below. Let's connect and share our thoughts on Silas and Nalina's journey. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support the channel, please hit that hype button. It helps get this story out to more listeners just like you.